it pops up on the screen, you're going to be like, wait, that is not the Lord's Prayer. So it's what we're going to do because we're using the same passage. I'm just going to put up some different translations that we're going to read together, so it'll give us just a different feel for a familiar prayer. So this is the one we've got for today. It's from a translation called The Voice. So let's read this together. Your prayers rather should be simple like this. Our Father in heaven, let your name remain holy. Bring about your kingdom, manifest your will here on earth as it is manifest in heaven. Give us each day that day's bread, no more, no less. And forgive us our debts as we forgive those who owe us something. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. But let your kingdom be, and let it be powerful and glorious forever. Amen. It's good to hear it different, right? So thank you all for your concern. Everybody's like, do you feel okay? I feel just fine. I don't know why I woke up with a gravelly voice this morning. So it's the voice I wish I had sometimes. But so today is that day. I can remember on the radio, people used to say, crank it up and rip the knob off. I'm like, I can do it. It's my day. That has nothing to do with this sermon at all. All right. So we're just going to transition right to prayer. Last week, we began talking about prayer. And we're going to do that over the next few weeks. We're going to stay in prayer, and we're going to be talking specifically, most of this is going to be in the Lord's Prayer the rest of the way here. So one of the things we set up as we were stepping into this topic is prayer can be a place of shame or guilt or inadequacy. Pick your word. But just when you start talking about how we should pray, it's like, yeah, okay, there's something here for me. And so it's just this struggle that we have these emotions that come up when we start talking about prayer. And so what we invited you to do just from the outset is just to acknowledge that your prayer life could be more than what it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. And specifically, I invited you to take out the should word. Should kind of comes with some baggage, well, here's what it should be, but doggone it, it's not. And to just use the word could, my prayer life could be more. That's a word of potential. There's room for growth. There's untapped potential here. And so one of the big ideas that I'm hoping we get, and you see it on the title slide, is that prayer is more than just talking to God. Now, it is talking to God. That's a part of it. But that is incomplete if you stop right there. And so if we simplify or strip prayer back to just talking to God, we're missing a piece of that we really need to understand to have prayer be more in our lives. So prayer is more than talking to God, and let's just add to that, and more than asking God for stuff, because that's our idea of talking to God in prayer is you go to God when you need to ask for stuff. And so if that's our understanding of prayer, it's going to make it really small and narrow. In fact, most of us, when we think of prayer, so you think talking to God, asking for things you need, and then we do it at church. That's the framework we put around prayer. And there's more to it than that. And what we introduced last week was the backdrop that makes prayer more is the relationship that you and I have with God. That's the backdrop of prayer. And so God loves you and he wants a relationship with you, and any meaningful relationship in your life is going to be more than just conversation, right? It's going to be. And so there is conversation in any meaningful relationship, but not just conversation. That's a part of it. And so our goal is to kind of open our eyes to this larger understanding of prayer so that maybe we can begin to grasp the value, the significance, and the purpose of prayer. And when we frame it in that context of our relationship with God, it starts to make some things fall into place and give us some handles to grow. So prayer is this essential part of our relationship with God. So when you start talking about all of that and you're like, okay, so prayer isn't just talking to God and prayer isn't just making my requests known to God, then what is it? Because that, for many of us, is our starting understanding. You go to God when you need to talk to him and you need stuff. So what is it then? And here's the good news. Jesus gave something for that. We call it the Lord's Prayer. So in Luke chapter 11, we read this. Once Jesus was in a certain place praying, and as he finished, one of his disciples came to him and said, "Lord, teach us to pray." So here's what I want you to understand about that request, like to understand what they're asking. So these are not people who prayer was a side thing or a small thing in their lives. These are people who prayer was very integrated into their lives. So this is not a new thing for them. It's not something they're not familiar with. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You know, their lives in some ways were organized around prayer times during the day. Their lives were organized around entering into that relationship with God. It was woven into their lives, saturated in such a way. So they had personal prayer, they had community prayer, they had ritual prayers. And so for the average God-fearing Jew, like this is an essential part of their lives, which makes it far more interesting, right? When this is something that is just woven through their lives for them to say, we may be missing something. And like when they watch Jesus pray, like something hit them like, okay, that is different than what we've seen or what we do. And so they asked Jesus, hey, so can you teach us to pray? These are people who know something about prayer saying, I think we don't know enough about prayer. Can you teach us? And so they realize there's this room for growth. There's this untapped potential that their prayer lives could be more. And they knew that because they watched Jesus. So Jesus began teaching on prayer. And last week we started with kind of the don'ts of prayer. That's where Jesus started. He said, okay, so you've seen the religious leaders. You see the people who pray, who want to be heard. Don't do that. Like, you're not praying at God for others to listen in. That's not what prayer is. Prayer isn't a performance, so don't dwell on what people think. Our problem is really the other way. We're not so worried about impressing people. We're worried about embarrassing ourselves. So, we avoid praying out loud because we're like, oh, that people are going to know that my prayer is terrible. And still the same thing. The issue is caring what people think. And so Jesus says, like, prayer isn't a performance, and don't pray for people, like for people to hear. It's not that. And you don't need to go on and on with a ton of words. Like, just be simple and tell God what you want. He already knows what you need. So you don't have to spend a lot of words to try to get his attention or pray something flowery. Just pray, right? So Jesus taught then, so here's what you need to do. Get alone with God. And so in the context of prayer is more, here's the thing we described last week, that part of how we understand prayer is more is prayer is spending quality time with God. That's more than talking to God. It's spending quality time with God. And so Jesus says, find a quiet place. Find a place where you can get alone, where you can eliminate the distractions, where you can be fully present, and then enter in to that relationship and that quality time with God. So that's kind of where we were, and I just want to catch us up again so that we're fully tracking as we step into the Lord's Prayer. So then he says, so here's how you should pray. And so today we're going to turn to the Lord's Prayer. It's really familiar, right? Easily the most quoted prayer probably in Christian history. Like it's quoted again and again, and that's why we put it up in a different translation so you could see it and hear it in a different way, because otherwise we go into autopilot, don't we? Like, and here's the downside of it being such a familiar prayer is we can hit autopilot, which means we say this prayer without the words engaging our hearts, without much thought to what we're saying. We're like, oh, we're saying the Lord's Prayer now, and then we just start, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, right? And so you just start saying it, and you're not really thinking about what you're saying. So we can be disconnected as we rattle it off. And just let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with us saying it. I'm saying the downside is when you say it again and again, you start to just say it. That's human nature. And so Luke 11, when they asked Jesus to teach him to pray, has this condensed version of the Lord's Prayer. But we're going to look at Matthew 6 that has the full version that we're familiar with, that when we quote it, this is what we quote. And so I'm going to read it to you again in a more familiar translation as we jump into it. So this is what it says. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And we'll stop right there. So, first thing I want you to notice about the Lord's Prayer, going back to Luke 11, the disciples did not ask Jesus, hey, give us a prayer to pray. They asked, will you teach us how to pray? So we use this prayer often, like we've been given a prayer to pray. And I'm not saying you can't do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But the request was, teach us to pray, not teach us a prayer. And so we can say it, we can quote it, we can repeat it. It's a great prayer. But to really unpack the power of this, you have to understand that it was given as a pattern, as sort of a guide. When you pray like this. This is how you should pray. Follow this example as your guide. And so here's the first thing we see in this example prayer, that it starts with God, not me. Right? So the first part of the prayer is, your kingdom, your will, on earth as it is in heaven. Your name, your kingdom, your will. Like, it starts with a focus on God. Our stuff doesn't come into the second part of the prayer. Now, if you're just quoting this prayer, that's only 8 seconds or something, right? Till I can get to my stuff. But in this pattern, in this guide that Jesus is giving us, it's like, so maybe don't make it all about you. Which, if we're going to be honest, that is how we do prayer, right? Like, what moves us to prayer is we've got some stuff that we need to bring to God. We've got some places in our lives where we need him to intervene. We've got some things we need or we want, and so we say, you know what, I should pray. I should bring that to God, which of course is good and right. But if you see the main point of prayer as just that, well, you should not be surprised that the idea of praying relationally doesn't come easy for you. We might get, like when we pray, you probably get some polite thank yous and a couple praises sprinkled in, kind of like a formality till you get to your stuff. But when it's all about my asks, my requests, what I want, what I need, then obviously who does the prayer start with and who does it center around? Me, right? Now, this is a relationship, so you are a part of that relationship. But how healthy is a relationship when everything is about you? That is what we call a dysfunctional relationship, isn't it? That is where people find themselves sitting in front of a therapist trying to figure out, how do I work in this relationship where it's all about the other person, right? So we know that's not a healthy relationship, but this is how we approach prayer. It's about what God can do for me and how he can intervene for me. So the example Jesus gives us then flips it almost like right from the beginning. So yes, you have needs, and yes, there are things in your life, and yes, God does care about those things, and yes, you should pray about those things. But if all you do in prayer is go down your list of stuff that you want God to do, let me just state this directly. If that's how you view prayer, you're looking for something that's more like a genie, right? That I'm going to tell you what I'm wishing, and then you're going to grant me that, which people like, that's the stuff of dreams. Like, that's an ideal relationship right there. A genie, right? Because by default, it's all about me. You're just here to make sure that I get what I'm wishing for. And this is how we approach prayer. Like, okay, God, so I'm going to come to you, I'm going to tell you what I want, and then you're going to give it to me. But that's not the nature of prayer, and that's not the nature of our relationship with God. And if we're honest, this is where prayer breaks down for many of us. Because sometimes there's frustration when it comes to prayer. And here's the frustration. I told God what I needed, but he didn't do what he was supposed to do. And so you become disillusioned with this thing called prayer. Because if the sole purpose of prayer is to get God to do things for me, if he doesn't do those things, then what is the point? If he doesn't do what I asked him to do, why am I praying? This is where we land if it's all about laying my stuff out before God and asking him to do stuff. And this leads to fundamental questions where people give up on prayer, like, does prayer even work? If prayer is about getting God to do what I want, does it even work? Like, I thought he would give me what I needed, but he didn't. And so you become disillusioned. You start asking questions and giving up on prayer. Because all starts with me, and it's all about what God can do for me. So I have a family member who adopted a teenager from Russia. She was 14 when they adopted her, and they prayed through this and just felt like this is what God was leading them to do, to adopt this young girl from an orphanage in Russia, and it was hard from the get-go. And that's not an unfamiliar story. But here's where it broke down almost immediately. This young girl coming from the orphanage had this vision of what this family was going to be. And it was going to be, I've been a poor girl in an orphanage my whole life, and now I'm having rich American parents who are going to give me everything I want. And so their idea of the relationship is we're going to be a family. We're going to love and support and care for each other. And her idea of the relationship was, you're going to say yes. And so you can imagine how that relationship broke down fairly quickly, right? You can imagine how dysfunctional that became. Like, her idea was, I want stuff. I've never had stuff. You're going to give me stuff because you're the rich American parents. And so when it was clear that that's not the nature of their relationship, there became strained relationships. Eventually, she disconnected from the family as soon as she was out of high school. Now, there's been some reconnection since then. But all of it fell apart based on one assumption. This whole relationship is, you give me what I want. So when we approach God that way, it's going to go a similar way to that, isn't it? This is what happens when prayer is all about me. So part of what we see in this prayer then, this is not me-centered. Just like any healthy relationship is not just me-centered. Yes, I am a part of that relationship, but I'm not the whole of it. So part of what we see in this prayer right from the start is that this is different than how we typically approach prayer, which is, it's all about me. So here's the second thing you notice right away, just in the words that Jesus uses. He says, pray like this, Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. So he starts with the word Father. You call him Father, which for some would have immediately been like, no, okay, so what he just said to do, don't do that. You don't do that. That is treating this like a comfortable relationship, that is not how, so I don't care what he just told you, you don't call him Father. Like, that would have been the reaction of some. It was this crazy idea, like, you don't just flippantly walk into God like he's your father. And think about all the routines and rituals that they had. Like if they were going to enter into the presence of God, it was a thing to get ready for that, wasn't it? So immediately when Jesus says to pray this way, there would be somebody be like, no, 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 that is not how that works. But Jesus starts off by saying, this is a relationship, like a child to a father. That's how this works. Now, let me just acknowledge this. For some of us, that's a barrier right away because whatever your relationship was with your father, and there's all kinds of stories, right? But where I want you to go is just, but this is what it should be like with a father that you know loves you and cares for you. And so Jesus throws out this radical picture of this intimate relationship with God as your father. So when you pray, he says, say, Father in heaven. All right, I'm just going to say this. Don't. I grew up in a church where people prayed sometimes out loud. And when they said this, Father in heaven, one person in particular I can remember kind of had a groan that led up to it. Like, oh, and then he'd drag out Father. Father. And I'm not mocking. Here's what I want you to see. That's not at all what Jesus is talking about. This is you have access to God. It would be much closer to, hey, Dad, can we talk? Much more like that. This place where you know you're safe, that you can walk in. That's the picture that Jesus gives us when he starts with this word, Father. It's this very relational word, this very safe word. And again, there are people who are like, that's not how you do that. So this, I think Jesus starting here is so important for us grasping prayer. So go back to the relationship idea, and he puts it in this relationship context. Talk to God as your Father, the one who sees and knows and cares. And maybe if we got this part right, prayer would start to reshape for us. In other words, like if you think of it like maybe like driving. So like you don't focus on your windshield, right? You look through the windshield to see what's around you. And I think in a similar way, like if we focus on prayer and praying better, it's a little bit like looking at the windshield instead of looking through it. Does that make sense? And so this idea then, like lean into this relationship with God as your Father, and it'll provide this new path forward for you in prayer. So that's the first phrase, Father in heaven. And then the second phrase immediately balances that. So for those who are saying, whoa, you can't do that, the second phrase is going to be like, okay, now I like that. That was going to satisfy them. So the second part says, hallowed be your name. So when you combine these two, here's what we get, that prayer is relational, but it's not flippant. There's this high regard for who God is. There's this intimacy and this ability to approach, but there's also this deep respect and awe. And they're combined together here. So, hallowed be your name. Hallowed is a word that we don't even use anymore, except it shows up in Halloween and the prayer here, right? I mean, otherwise we don't really use this word. But hallowed is to make holy. Or if I'm going to make up a word, it's holify. Like it is to make something holy. And here's the idea of what this is saying, that, okay, Father, you are holy. Make your holy character known. And so you begin by, in this prayer, approaching boldly to God as your Father, but then you pause to acknowledge who God is. That you begin to grasp who you're talking to. that you pause and almost connect how significant a relationship this is, right? That I can boldly call him Father, but this is God. This is the creator and sustainer of all things. And here's what I would invite us to do just as we look at this pattern. Don't rush past these first two things. This first idea of Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. A God who is intimate and approachable, and a God who is above and beyond anything you know or understand. It's both. And the more time you spend acknowledging and experiencing who God is, the more confidence you're going to have putting your needs into his hands. So don't rush past this. And again, we're not always good at spending time here. We're not even sure how to do that. We get some thank yous in and a couple praises in, and then I've got some things, right? And again, like I don't want you to hear in any way that we're saying don't bring your things. God wants you to bring your burdens and your fears and your challenges. He is your loving Father, right? So he cares. But sometimes we approach it more like we're buttering God up than that we're seeing who he is. This is about pausing for perspective. So in the prayer is more idea, prayer, in this sense, provides perspective. It's me taking in and grasping who God is. His nature, his character, his reputation, his power. And the degree to which that sinks in, well, that's going to impact the rest of your life, how you view things and see things. So this, like pausing and getting this right, this perspective, is to remind me of the proper context of everything else in my life. My problems and issues that I want to get to fit in this context. My issues, my sicknesses, my fears, my struggles, my finances, my relationships, all get fit into this larger perspective of a God who is intimate and approachable and big and powerful and beyond, right? It puts all of it in perspective. And so there's this great value for us in pausing to consider who God is and then let that frame the things that I am going to get to at some point. But don't rush past this. So just how this could look. Like, here's what I find. Like, as I listen to preachers say things like that, I'm like, so what are we talking about here? What does that mean? What does that look like in real life? And so if you prayed something the way this prayer begins, it might be something like this, like, Father, thank you that I can come just right to you. And I just want to invite you to make your name known in my life. Like that there would be some connection that people would see in my life, your reputation. That you would reveal who you are, your character, your heart, your power. And that would be evident in my life and in my circumstances. That it would be something I see and something others see. Hallowed be your name. May your reputation be lifted because of your presence in my life. So don't rush past this, right? And I think most of us are like, I would love to spend more time there. I'm just not sure what to do. So I say some thank yous and I say some praises, and then I don't know what else to do, so I just start talking about the stuff I wanted to talk about. And so I think this is important for us. Like, if you're a skeptic at all, or ever had a skeptical question, one of the questions that people ask is, why does God need to hear me talk about how awesome he is? And here's what I want you to get is, this isn't about God needing you to say how awesome he is. This is about perspective. This is about you being able to surrender some things in your life because you know who he is. So it is not saying like God's sitting there like, that's really all you could come up with. No, this is you getting the perspective of who God is as you step into that prayer space with him. This is where we need to spend a little more time in our prayer. And as Jesus sets out this pattern, this is where it starts. Last thing, and we're not going to be able to hit this all the way. We'll touch on this again next week. But this idea of your kingdom come, your will be done. It's understanding and choosing God's priorities, not mine. So again, it's not about me. And this is where we often struggle, right here. This idea where I can feel a little bit hesitant. Because here's how we approach prayer. So God, I'm going to tell you about my will and my kingdom. We don't use those words, but that's what we approach in prayer, right? When I get to my stuff is my will and my kingdom. So my prayer requests look like sometimes, I'm going to give you a few suggestions of how you might be involved here, God. Right? Like, this is my will and my kingdom, and here's how you can be involved, God. And so this phrase flips that and says, okay, so here's where I'm going to start, God. I'm going to start with your will and your kingdom over mine. And I got some things that I need to bring to you, and I have some ideas of how I'd like you to do some things, but from the get-go, I'm going to surrender my ideas and my kingdom to your ideas and your kingdom, which has pretty significant implications, right? Because that means not my plans for my life, but yours. Not my preferences, but yours. Not my will for my relationships, but yours. Not my will for my family, but yours. Not my will for my health, but yours. Not my will for my career, but yours. And then you start to see this other piece of prayer. That not only does what Jesus give us offer us prayer as perspective, but we come to prayer as surrender, of letting go. And by the way, if you rush through the first part, the Father who is approachable and loves you, and the God who is awesome and bigger than anything you can imagine, if you rush past that, the whole idea of surrender is so much harder. Because again, that's the perspective that allows me to let go and say, you can do this better than I can. If you really take in who God is, the next logical thing is to say, yeah, so not my will, but yours. It comes down to this, right? I have a limited perspective. It's funny, like we think we know how things should go, but we don't, do we? Like we know this much. It's like reading, like I'm in chapter 4 of a book and I'm asking something about chapter 8 and I don't even know how the story unfolds yet. Let me give you an illustration. So when we moved to Shelby and I pastored there for a while, we were paid nothing. Like it was a faith thing. Like, okay, God, we know you're calling us here, but wow, can I live on that? And so it's fine. God provided for everything we needed, but we had to buy a house. And so there were very few options for us based on the income that we were getting. And so we had a couple that we were looking at. Well, there was this one house that we're like, God, could you give us that house? Like that would be like for all the sacrifices we've made to come here, could that just be your gift for us? And we tried, and it just wasn't going to work. And there aren't many times in my life where I felt like I was really miffed at God, like had a little attitude. But this was one of them, where I just felt like, you know what? We sacrificed. Like the least you could do. And I'm just being honest. Like there was a little bit of an attitude like, why? Why couldn't you give us this thing and just acknowledge the sacrifices we've made? It sounds so arrogant, doesn't it? I'm sorry. This is just where I was. But fast forward 3 years. So Shelby had a massive flood. And every house on the street that we wanted to be on, every house was wiped out. Like foundations moved. And like 3 years later, I'm like, thank you for not listening to me. Right? But I tell you that to tell you this, like we have these ideas that we know best. These wants and these dreams. And it's okay, you can have your wants and your dreams. But the idea here is, if it's going to be your kingdom and your will, then I'm going to surrender that house that somehow I felt like was going to complete me. I don't know. But only to realize in a pretty powerful way, no, okay, so let's go your will, not mine. Right? And you probably can all point to something similar in your life. Like where you asked for something and God didn't give it, and a few years later you're like, wow, I am so glad you didn't listen to me. Right? And so this is the idea that we're saying, not my will, but yours. But if we're going to get there, well, then we have to start with this understanding of who God is that we get in the first line of the prayer. He is the Father who loves you, who knows you, who invites you into his presence. And he is the holy God who sees and knows more than you will ever see and know. Invites you to go ahead and bring your burdens, but surrender ultimately to him. That's the invitation. And here's what I hope you're grasping as we unpack all of this together. This is a prayer that you can quote and pray, but it's a pattern. And it's a pattern that once you start to grasp it, you're like, that could flip my prayer life right there. And so we're going to press into that a little more over the next couple of weeks. We're going to kind of walk through the different pieces. Next week, you'll be happy to know you get to your stuff, like the stuff that we want to bring to God in prayer, but you see how it fits in the context. And so we'll step into that next Sunday. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to invite us to stand. I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to sing a song together, and we'll just kind of wrap this up. But let me invite you to stand, and I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing.